All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson in the unit uh, Age of Imperialism. Today's lesson, or whenever you're watching this, even in the evening, is the British in India. So our objectives and standards to, excuse me, summarize British interest in India and analyze British control in India. And take a moment here to read over the standards, if you would, please. And our desired result is, how did the British become involved in India? So the British arrive in India. So economic interest in India by the British began in the 1600s. But by the middle of the 1700s, the East India Company, which was owned by British stockholders and its troops, had taken control over India. And their rule is going to expand over time. So originally, Great Britain really didn't have, the British government really didn't have control over India. It was more of this East India Company, so more of like a corporation had control of India. So like we said, Great Britain, in terms of the government, largely stayed out of the business of the East India Company, and the East India Company made a lot of the rules and the decisions in terms of how to control and rule India. The East India Company also had, like we said, Indian soldiers. They were known as sepoys. I don't believe there should be another A there. My apologies on that. Sepoys. India had a large amount of natural resources that could be used by Great Britain. Therefore, the British referred to the country as the jewel in the crown and considered it the most valuable of all the colonies that they controlled, because there were so many natural resources that Great Britain could use for many different purposes. So you'll see here that here are some a depiction of Sepoy soldiers, Indian soldiers. You'll see that they have the kind of typical red coats of the British of the time, of the British military, but they're what they're wearing on their heads is very different, obviously, than what the British would typically wear. So while they were very similar to what British soldiers and British military would wear, they also had some different outfits as well, or different ways to distinguish themselves as well. Now, there are going to be some trade policies. The British had set up restrictions on the Indian economy. So India was only allowed to produce raw materials such as silk. Indian silk is very good, is very fine, it's very precious even today. But Indian silk back in the 1800s and especially the 1700s and during those time periods, very precious, and very precious to especially the wealthy classes in Great Britain. A lot of people had their clothing or their curtains, or other fabrics made out of this Indian silk. So that's what this background here shows you, is Indian silk recently. But Indian silk was to be produced along with other raw materials for Great Britain, and India was not allowed to compete with British goods, meaning that India could only buy goods and other things like that from Great Britain. So kind of remember, even with the American colonies, if you can, that the British American colonies were kind of forced to only buy certain things prior to our own country's independence. We had to kind of buy tea from the East India Company and things like that. So India kind of has the same type of scenario here with Great Britain as well. Some transportation and trading facts. The British also established a railroad system in the country that could be used to transport raw goods and manufactured products. Again, these included items such as coffee and tea. And the British also shipped opium from India to China in exchange for tea. We'll talk a little bit later on about the Opium War in China between the British and the Chinese. A huge problem that kind of causes problems between the British and the Chinese later on down the road. In case you don't know, opium is a very addictive drug, still is today, and in the 1800s, many Chinese were becoming addicted to this very deadly kind of hostile drug. And again, we'll talk more about that later on. But for the time being, we just need to know that the British did ship opium that was from India to China in exchange for tea. So what's the good and bad in terms of Great Britain and India? Well, some of the negatives. The British obviously controlled most of the political and economic power. The Indians had very little say in how trade was handled or how their government worked. So that's going to be a problem. There were also restrictions on Indian industries, such as like we were saying, the British controlled who and where the Indians could trade with. They weren't allowed to buy from the British and trade with the British mostly. So that was a problem. The change to cash crops, very similar to Africa, where African farmers were forced to kind of give up their agricultural ways of growing food for their families and forced to grow products for companies such as cotton. Same thing's going to happen in India, and this can also create famine and other problems. There's also going to be some social and religious racism as well between the British and the Indians. Some positives, we'll see improvements in transportation, such as the railroad. As the British come to India, they'll bring new health and sanitation improvements with them. So we'll see changes in that atmosphere, which will help improve the lifestyle of some Indians. We'll also see the establishment of colleges and schools. So we'll see the British help bring about some educational changes, and many prestigious schools are still located in India today. And we'll also see the end of local warfare and bandits. Again, very similar to Africa, where we had local tribes fighting amongst each other for control of a certain area or region. We'll begin to see as the British arrive that those areas tend to quote-unquote settle down a little bit or become more peaceful. Alright, so please try your best on the questions that follow, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Hope you have a good day or night, and talk to you soon. Okay, in our closure, how did the British become involved in India? So things to think about when answering this question, and also when answering your other questions as well as you work through the assignment here. What were some of the reasons the British became involved, in India? How did they become involved? What types of policies or procedures did they put in place? And then what were some of the good and bad elements of imperialism or the British in India? Have a great rest of your day or night. Please let me know of any questions or concerns, and I hope to talk to you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.